Okay, well, I just wrapped up my morning Writing 102 Introduction to Academic Writing lecture this morning, and it turned into a really nice discussion about some points on rhetoric. I essentially introduced the topic of rhetoric. They read an article from writingcommons.org. We're using this OER, Open Educational Resource. Really, really short article about rhetoric that I'm not crazy about it. It has a 2-minute video that explains the triangle of rhetor, text, and audience, and then context surrounding it, and this kind of vats versus Bitzer disagreement that I don't think serves a particularly fantastic introduction to rhetoric and definitions of rhetoric. So I of course expand on this and bring in some historical context, and then we ended up talking about contemporary examples of digital advertising and retargeting and the kind of psychological mastery that social media and emergent technology companies are using. And of course, they actually hire teams of psychologists to work with their software engineers to design highly addictive programs. And of course, we know that Cambridge Analytica was, say, illegally using Facebook data from citizens in the US to influence elections globally and identify, say, persuadable people based on analyses done on 5,000 data points and the big 5 psychological characteristics. So I just kind of wanted to rehash some of those ideas that we talked about in my classroom this morning, and I think it'd be a useful kind of video as a, say, what is rhetoric, or an introduction to rhetoric in terms of writing and academic writing, and what is it? And first and foremost, we have to eliminate all these misconceptions we have about rhetoric. In common usage, the term rhetoric has a negative connotation. We say about a political speech, for example, oh, that's just empty rhetoric. Or we think of the term a rhetorical question as being a question posed not to receive an answer, it's posed to have a purpose. Now that meaning is maybe more close to what we conceive rhetoric as. So rhetoric for Aristotle, he laid out this definition as being the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. And so rhetoric is what, though? It's a field of study, but it's also an art, and it's a mode of thinking and acting in the world, and it's also an academic discipline, and it's a practice. So it's kind of difficult to pin down exactly what we mean by rhetoric in an academic context, but for the sake of, say, an introductory writing class, it's nice to think of it, I think of it as, and this is how I explain it, as, say, a toolkit you can use to better persuade through your writing, and a toolkit you can use to better analyze communication in the world that's trying to persuade you. And that's a definition that seems to click with students, because then we immediately start talking about advertising and ethos, pathos, logos, and the domains in which we can be persuaded. So, yeah. Every good discipline, this is something else I wanted to talk about, every academic discipline conducted properly should ask itself what it is. So even in the study of biology, biologists will ask, well, does this fall under where does this fall in within the discipline? You know, is this research better suited for X journal or Y journal or Z journal, depending on the context and, you know, what are the methodologies involved and what is being studied. And such is the case with rhetoric too, that the boundaries of the discipline are always shifting. And my personal contribution in my dissertation and some of the work that I do in my peer-reviewed research looks at how music is persuasive, and particularly how music persuades us beyond just in emotional dimensions, how music works on us in other ways, and how it's appropriated in political contexts, and how it works, the sort of logical functions that it has. So in the domain of logos, how does music function to be persuasive, and some of these interesting questions. And so this is non-discursive rhetoric. This is persuasive communication that's say, symbolic and encoded. Music can be encoded. It's not always, it's actually readily perceptible through compressions and rarefactions and air pressure, but can be encoded into symbols, right, in sheet music, say. So we're talking about non-discursive persuasion as how can we persuade individuals without the use of language or written language, and there are many ways that this occurs. Some folk studies say the rhetoric of dance and this sort of thing. And so there's communication, of course, that's bodily and has to do with proxemics and kinesthetics, and there's communication we do that's nonverbal, of course. So this is an interesting thing about it. So anyway, an academic discipline always questions itself what it is and what are the boundaries of its study and what appropriately falls into the study, and you kind of push the edges of it a little bit, and sometimes the classic, those who have already laid their foundation in the field will push back a little bit and say, no, not exactly, and that's more or less what happens in peer review. Also an examination of the methodology that's being used, mostly by experts that have some level of familiarity with the methodologies in play, so they can see if it's sound and whether it qualifies in that domain as being something that's legitimately using the best practices in that field and can be counted as a significant contribution to that academic field. So where did this go then? We start talking about, I use the really clear-cut example of how I am rhetorical in a classroom. So I choose consciously to say wear this old suit coat because it has a kind of presence of authority. That works on the level of ethos or character, and etymologically you can see where how ethos and ethics are related, and ethics is like how do you compose your character? What is your kind of fundamental, what are your sort of fundamental values as an individual? The composition of your character is your ethics. So ethos has to do with credibility. Do you trust this person or not? And we talked about how sometimes we trust people too much. Just because you have on the suit and the tie doesn't mean that you have credibility in the world, but we tend to think that it does. We tend to be easily persuaded by dress, by suit and tie. And this is the Ted Bundy sort of method, right? Is look like a normative individual and then go off and kill people, because it's more easy to entrap individuals when you look like, say, a normative, well put together individual. And we do this when we cut our hair in a certain way, and perhaps we shave our faces, and we wear certain types of clothing to present ourselves in a credible manner. And so I do this in the classroom, and say I even speak with a certain timbre and with a certain pacing and a rhythm, and I speak with a certain volume to denote authority or at least some level of expertise and credibility on my part. So we start talking about really practical ways that rhetoric is involved in daily communication and daily ways of life. And even when you go into a job interview, say, you want to think about your audience, the individual that you're speaking with, the hiring manager or the hiring panel, and you present yourself in such a way that you appear to be a credible individual in their eyes. So you're thinking about audience, and you're thinking about using the available means of persuasion that you have at your fingertips. So that's an art, it's a practice, but it's also the theory of thinking about why does that function and how does it work. And we draw interdisciplinarily from psychology and from other fields of study, from the theory of language. And there's not, say, a science of rhetoric, but I think we need to perhaps push in that direction a little more and work more collaboratively and interdisciplinarily to better study persuasion and what types of universals there are in persuasion, and maybe to break out of the box of the rhetorical triangle a little bit, because those kinds of heuristics just don't always map perfectly onto the way that persuasion is working now, especially in the absolute state of bombardment that we're in contemporary living, and especially in the US and in other places too, where marketing is not well regulated. You might see thousands of advertisements in a day. You get pop-ups when you're browsing the web. You're going to be retargeted. You have hyper-targeted social media advertisements that are coming at you. And a lot of people don't even understand, say, how they're targeted or how they're designed. Like your data, your demographic, you have a demographic profile if you use any kind of social media or Google products or Twitter or Instagram owned by Facebook, any of these social media platforms, digital platforms, anything web-based, data is being gathered because you're voluntarily submitting data to these companies that then have huge server farms in California, and they store all this information, and then advertisers can use it to target you based on your age range, your interests, your spending habits, your income, whether stated or predicted, the type of career that you have, your education, your background, even credit card data can get linked in with this data. And so different data sets can be combined, and then you're targeted with very, very specific types of advertisements that are designed and optimized to, say, persuade you to purchase a product or to think a certain way or to vote a certain way. So this is the degree to which we can be persuaded is a really important topic, especially now in such a state of marketing and advertising that we live in, and especially with companies now taking strategies like trying to be more and more authentic and embedding themselves in actual communities of people. Say, when you go out to a bar and you don't know if you're speaking with an individual or an individual who's been hired by Anheuser-Busch to say, oh, I love Budweiser so much, let me buy you one, and then you become a loyal Budweiser consumer or something like that. So, and this happens at political rallies too, of course, like actors that are paid to be present and hold signs and wear certain hats and t-shirts. And so in a really strange way, almost everything we do has been say invaded by marketing and advertising to attempt to persuade us to do certain things and buy certain products and act in certain ways. And so the way I view rhetoric is it's in many ways a toolkit to help us step back a little bit and analyze those messages and try to understand the way that they work us over, and try to understand the way that they're formulated and in what ways they work us over, whether it's through an appeal to logic or an appeal to our emotion or an appeal to credibility. We have to question, what are the origins of these advertisements? And now, in the atmosphere that we live in the climate, this kind of hyper-targeted marketing climate, we have to think about how did that message get to us too? And this is something I'm really interested in, is like systems of distribution in digital media and social media. You have to think too, how did this advertisement find me? What piece of information did I leave in my past in the internet that would link me to Kleenex brand? Did I post something about having a cold on Facebook 2 years ago and that's why I'm in this data set? Or is it because you have children and you posted a picture of a runny nose and made some comment or this or that? Or maybe you went on Amazon and you searched for Kleenex and you bought a bulk 10 boxes of tissues. You have to think about the way that the message may have found you to analyze a message properly today, I think, especially in the context of digital media and social media. You want to think also about how did that message find me? And what did I leave behind? What data did I leave behind that I was then tracked? And you can see this really simply in the example of retargeting. Like, I'm certain that you have at some point, say, went onto Amazon and you looked at a specific product, and I used this example in class today and I got a lot of hands raising. You went onto Amazon, you looked at a certain product, and then you navigated away from Amazon, and on a different website you saw an advertisement for the exact same product that you were looking at on Amazon. Well, that's called retargeting, and we know how that works. I did a little bit of that when I was working in digital strategies for a healthcare company. It's like it's really simple. You put a tracking pixel in the website and you gather the data that's data that you're voluntarily submitting and sending out there, and that data is then used with third-party affiliate sites to push that product upon you again. And that's based on some clear data from psychology about memory, and and then also some old ideas in marketing, like you have to hear a message 7 times to remember it. It's still kind of thought like the more that you see a message, the more ingrained it becomes in your mind, the more conscious you are of it. And a lot of companies use this strategy, say, because they might have a service or product that's not necessary right at the moment of messaging, but might become necessary later. So this is a fixture in healthcare communications and marketing. You push brand awareness, and it's maybe not too different from Coca-Cola either, right? I'll explain that in a second. But you push awareness of a brand so that when the need arises to have surgery, you think X hospital instead of A hospital. That's the function of, say, awareness marketing or brand awareness marketing, and it's a strategy that companies use. So the more it's in your memory, the more you are likely to gravitate toward that because it's familiar, you know it, and for some reason, and you might unquestionably just say, oh, I trust them because I know the name, right? It's familiar to you, and so it has a kind of inherent ethos or credibility again. And strategies, other companies, not just healthcare, they use these strategies like Coca-Cola. Like you see a television advertisement, not that many, TV is kind of dying, cable TV is dying a little bit, but you might see it an advertisement on YouTube for Coca-Cola. And you don't immediately go out and buy Coca-Cola, but the next time you're at a gas station or in a grocery store, you might recollect that message of, the people dancing and sipping the Coca-Cola, and think, refreshing, right? You make that kind of connection and then you purchase the thing, almost unconsciously, like with a certain degree of just automatic response to the brand recognition and the color recognition and these sorts of things. So this is essentially what we talked about. There were a lot of other interesting things we covered this morning in Writing 102, but I really liked this as kind of we talked about the sophists and how it used to be rhetoric kind of came to fruition and was starting to be studied seriously and became even economically important because in ancient Greece and Athens, if you were accused of a crime, now I wasn't there, but this is these are the records that we have, and in my reading of ancient Greek history and of ancient Greek philosophy, this is what I've gathered, is that you may have to go defend yourself in front of a jury if you're accused of a crime in ancient Athens. And we're talking about 2,500 years ago, 5,000, 6,000 BCE. So if you're accused of a crime, you have to defend yourself, right? This kind of system of legal representation wasn't set up the way that we have it now, where you hire a lawyer to argue for you. You have to go argue for yourself a lot of the times in a lot of cases. So it makes a lot of sense to train yourself in the art of oratory and the art of composing a speech and in the art of dialogue and discourse so that you can make a compelling case for your innocence and so you're not sentenced to death. And then, of course, some citizens of ancient Athens saw an economic opportunity here where these are the sophists, where they say, okay, well, if you pay me some money, I'll train you to be a great orator, a great rhetorician. And so the art of rhetoric is born, and it's been in and out of our colleges and our public education curriculum since then. At some points in history, like our Baroque composers were well informed in rhetorical theory and even thought about rhetoric when they were composing music at times. And then lately it seems like public education doesn't really concern itself with rhetoric particularly. It's sometimes in writing classes it'll pop up, but it's been a mainstay in higher education since at least the 60s or 70s. My history of rhetoric in U.S. colleges isn't great. Someone could really go at length and tell you about how it was readopted into universities and how it kind of came to form the core of composition curriculum, but I don't particularly study composition in that way, though it's interesting nonetheless. But so that's rhetoric. A couple ideas here. Aristotle defined it as the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion, which means it's a sense that you have and that you develop of how you can persuade your audience given the tools in your surrounding. What are the abilities that you have and to persuade others? And it's a theory, or say there's theories of rhetoric, there's an art to it, it's a practice. it takes place, it has practical applications in reality, like I discussed in this video, but we also theorize about it. It's also an academic discipline. It's something you do, and it's something you think about, and it's constantly evolving, and we're constantly kind of changing the parameters of the discipline and pushing it in new directions and thinking about what it should do and how it works. And even in this Hauser book I'm using, Gerard Hauser, he makes some allusions to the possibility that rhetoric, say, there's a kind of idealistic sense where rhetoric can lead us to a better world, in a way. That's how I read certain passages. I'll look at that in more detail later. But, through dialogue, we kind of construct a more not open society, but we better figure out what we should be doing to construct an ideal world when we engage in dialogue with others, and that's the kind of logic that has built up society. Those are sticky points. That's for another video. But thanks for tuning in. These are some ideas about rhetoric and recapping some interesting, say, digital persuasion that my students are seeing on a daily basis in some topics we covered today. So I'm making videos almost daily. I hope you'll tune in and comment if you have ever seen an ad retargeted to you, if you want to contribute to the discussion, and take care of yourselves. Have a good day.